At 5:15 p.m. on June 28, 1980, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson drove his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana, which is a small community just outside of Indianapolis. On the back of the motorcycle, with her arms wrapped around his waist, was Robert's wife. Her name was Wanda. The couple was on their way to visit family, and they were hoping to get there as soon as possible, not because they wanted to visit, but because there was a big storm rolling in, and they were hoping to beat the rain. In fact, right now, right above them, the sky was turning a dark gray and looked very ominous. But as Robert nudged his engine to go a little bit faster, these big raindrops began pelting his arms, and he knew the skies were opening up and he would have to pull over so he and his wife could put on rain jackets. And so Robert pulled over to the side of the road, and as soon as he was stopped, Wanda climbed off, and Robert was about to climb off as well and open up the little trunk in the back of the motorcycle to get the rain jackets. But before he did that, there was this sudden flash of light, and then Robert felt pain all throughout his body. His muscles went totally rigid, and then he crumpled off his bike onto the ground, and everything went black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. Now, Kimberly had been briefed up on this situation. A man and his wife had pulled over on the side of Interstate 74, and the man had been struck by lightning. And so as she ran up to the couple, she could see Robert was on the ground. He was not moving. His skin was waxy and gray, and his wife was sort of in shock, and she was standing next to him, just kind of sobbing uncontrollably. And Kimberly, she jumped into action. She jumped down next to Robert, and she felt for a pulse, but he didn't have one. At this point, Kimberly knew she maybe had a couple of minutes here to basically revive Robert, or he was doomed. And so Kimberly, she worked immediately on stabilizing Robert's spine, while one of her team members, one of the other first responders, jumped in and began doing CPR. And then a third first responder hopped on the ambulance radio and called in an emergency medical helicopter to get here and fly Robert to a hospital as soon as possible. They quickly got a response from the helicopter crew saying they were en route. But before the crew or any of the first responders could communicate any further over the radio, suddenly, out of nowhere, their ambulance just completely shut down, like completely shut off. The lights, the sirens, the engine, everything went completely silent. And this was a huge problem because some of the medical equipment that they needed to keep Robert alive until the helicopter got here required the ambulance to be on to use it. And so with the ambulance off, it was useless. But in addition to just what a problem this was, this also was like really confusing to Kimberly and the other first responders. Because when ambulances are built, they are built with the idea that there can never be a situation where the ambulance just totally turns off. Because again, it's like a worst case scenario. And so they give each ambulance 2 batteries, a primary and a backup, so that if for some reason the primary dies, you always have that backup and can always use the life-saving equipment. So the idea that both of these batteries failed simultaneously was like, how? How could that possibly happen? But before Kimberly or the other first responders could even begin to understand how that happened, something else began happening. They turned and saw there was this woman dressed in this old, long black dress running up the road, this desolate highway. This woman is charging up the road, screaming at them, and above her head, she's waving a Bible, and she's yelling at them to, hey, let me touch him. Let me touch him. I can save him. And the first responders are looking at each other like, what is going on here? Now, none of the first responders, nor Wanda, had any idea who this woman was as she continued running up the road, waving her Bible and yelling at them. But again, you need to picture this scene. The ambulance is off. They can't do anything to help Robert. They're basically waiting for the helicopter to show up, which they hope is on the way, but they can't communicate with the helicopter. And Robert basically is clinically dead at this point. He doesn't have a pulse. He's been struck by lightning. Like there's nothing anybody can do except wait around and hope the helicopter shows up. And so when this woman came running up to the scene saying she could touch Robert and save him, none of the first responders were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's bring her in. She can save the day. But they were sort of like, well, no one else is doing anything, and they looked over at Wanda, and she was just as shocked as they were at this woman's arrival and what she was saying. And so the first responders and Wanda just kind of stood there and allowed this woman in her black dress with her Bible to just wander up and crouch down next to Robert and begin this totally bizarre ritual. At first, the woman just began praying over Robert, and she's holding her Bible and she's very focused and she's calm. And again, Kimberly, the first responders, and Wanda, they're all just standing there looking at each other and looking at this woman being like, what is going on here? But then eventually this woman in black, she begins getting really animated and begins slamming her Bible on the ground over and over again and begins screaming up at the heavens, demanding they save this man's life. Now, Kimberly and the others and Wanda, they're all watching this in total shock and just kind of let it keep on happening. Because again, it was sort of like, at this point, we're already committed, and what harm can this woman do? I mean, Robert's clinically dead. And so Kimberly and the others just stood there silently watching as this woman in black continued to slam her Bible and demand that this man be saved. And then it was like something came over this woman. It was like she was completely possessed, and she grabbed her Bible and she lifted it over her head. She's kneeling right beside Robert. And when she opened her mouth and looked up at the sky, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was like another voice, and she began speaking in tongues, things that didn't make any sense. She's saying all these crazy gibberish things to the sky. And as Kimberly and the others are getting frightened by what they're seeing and are about to step in, it was like the woman just stopped. And she stood up slowly, turned, and walked down the road back the direction she came. And within seconds of this woman beginning to walk off, the ambulance turned back on, lights, sirens, the engine all came back on, nothing wrong with it, and Robert began to breathe. Kimberly and the other first responders and Wanda just stared at Robert in total shock. He had not had a heartbeat for several minutes, like he was dead. How he's alive when there was no medical intervention, really, because the ambulance was off. The only intervention was this woman and whatever she was doing. Like, nobody could comprehend that. But before anybody could make sense of that, the medical helicopter arrived, and seconds later it was chaos getting Robert onto the helicopter. And then before long, Robert, Wanda, and the helicopter took off, and then before long, Kimberly and the other first responders were just left there in the first moment of silence they had had for several minutes, just standing on the side of Interstate 74 thinking, what just happened? Now, none of the first responders wanted to admit to this, but they were all thinking the same thing. That woman in black had to have done something that, brought Robert back to life. I mean, there really was no other explanation. However, when the first responders just all kind of looked in the direction where this woman had turned and walked off just a couple of minutes earlier, she was gone. Now keep in mind where she had come from, where she had, run up the road from. It was just one big open road with really no obstructions. And then off to the side of the road was this huge open field. Basically, if someone had been walking for only a couple of minutes in that direction, from their vantage point, they would have seen them. There's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go. But she was gone. However, Kimberly and the other first responders would quickly learn that this particular stretch of highway, in fact, more specifically, the field off the side of this highway, had great significance to this whole story. That big field that lined Interstate 74, where effectively the woman in black had disappeared to, used to be the home of a place called the Acton Campground, which was a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of this community were known for their really loud prayer style and also for speaking in tongues. Now, unfortunately, this community actually burned to the ground in 1864. Afterwards, they rebuilt, but then in 1905, disaster struck again, and it burned to the ground again. And this time, they did not rebuild. Instead, the community was leveled to the ground, was sold off, and then eventually was just abandoned and became a big empty field. After the story of Robert's miraculous recovery began to spread, some people began to think that the woman in black might have been a ghost of one of these Acton residents from the 1800s who basically was drawn out to save Robert's life. Also, her intense prayers and speaking in tongues, along with the woman disappearing back into the field where the Acton campground had been, certainly seemed to cement the idea that this theory could actually be true. However, since that day in 1980, no one has seen the woman in black again. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now, Daisy was pregnant, and so she and Antonio were very excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Waimama, which is a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic, and he had the skills to do it. From the time he was a toddler, he had always been obsessed with cars, breaking apart his toy cars and putting them back together. And then as he got a little bit older, he began drawing these very intricate drawings of cars that he loved or designs for new cars. And then when he was a teenager, he began actually tinkering around with real cars until he finally acquired a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he tricked out with all these fancy lights and special rims and this huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. It was thanks in part to this truck, which he nicknamed Casper, that Antonio, who was too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met up with Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup for other car enthusiasts, where you could basically park your vehicle and you could walk around and see what other people did to upgrade or enhance their vehicles. And so while Antonio was there, he was walking around when he saw on the far side of this meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman, and he found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, she eventually would look up and she would smile at him, and the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, and the couple had announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby, Antonio got yet another good piece of news. He'd landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant, which was located in Apollo, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of Antonio's parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to eventually become an auto mechanic, but this job paid $12 an hour, nearly double what he was used to making. And so with this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to raise enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked at this company that this was actually a really easy job, that pretty much you just rolled around on golf carts all day picking up trash. It was perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous this thing was. It was basically this huge factory that sat right up against the water, and there were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of this factory with white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity, and they did this by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units that were inside of this factory that Antonio was looking at. And each of these units is comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. And so coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom of the boiler, creating some steam. And that steam goes up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, creating the electricity. And then the steam just continues up the boiler and then out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer units, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built in the 1970s, so they were older models, and they did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag, which basically is molten lava, like the stuff that comes out of volcanoes. That's what slag is. And so as this slag kind of builds up inside of the boiler, it would go through this man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler, and right below that hole is this 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank, and this red-hot slag, it basically dumps down into that water, which cools it off, turning it into these kind of glassy rocks, and then they settle coil at the bottom of this 30-foot cooling tank, and at the bottom of the cooling tank is this grinding mechanism that pulls these hardened, cooled off little boulders of slag into it, and it crushes them up and spits them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. And then these chips get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, he hopped out of his truck, and he headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for Antonio. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety and training, and then when he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate around the inside of this huge factory, which was basically this huge maze. And he found very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work, as there were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just kind of walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout and also on what his job would entail. On Thursday, June 29th, so just 4 days into doing this new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood because the next day, that Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound and they were going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl. And he was very excited about this. And so Antonio came downstairs, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek, and he headed outside into his truck and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store when she pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed Antonio had called her and she missed it, but he had left a voicemail. And so she played the voicemail and then put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work, no problem. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility and picked up trash, and that was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, two fairly significant issues arose simultaneously inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump into the water chamber. And so as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into that chamber. And so all of this slag was just building up on top of itself inside of the boiler. And then in the water chamber, completely unconnected from the issue in the boiler, the slag that had fallen into the water chamber, that had cooled and settled at the bottom, it had landed in such a way that it actually blocked the grinding mechanism. And so none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. And so they needed to fix these two issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective. Now, the safe way to fix these two blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler. And then once it was off, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself and break up the blockage over the man-sized hole, and you could send a team into the water chamber after you drained it to chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. And so the Tampa Electric Company decided, you know what? Let's just have them fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. And so at 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. And so the plan was to empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2, and then once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that up, giving them a line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber where that grinding mechanism was, where all those slag rocks had kind of come to a stop on top of it, and they would fire water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to attempt to dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. And then after they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and they would somehow deal with the blockage inside of the boiler. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked their employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on, and in the past, nothing bad had ever happened, and so these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just totally routine, that we would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out, What they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at this plant. But either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2, and they began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just going to be there to clean up during and after the operation. And so he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back, just kind of standing back, watching the other guys do their jobs. Now, you need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and then above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. So there's coal actively burning inside of it. There's red hot slag, so like lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they are dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation begins. The senior plant manager has the water chamber drained, and then after it's empty, they open the doghouse door, and Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through this door at the big slag rocks that are sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. And it wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some progress, and Antonio likely was just kind of getting bored waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup. And then as he's standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. And so you have all this slag that's building up. It's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the weight of all that slag broke through that plug, immediately creating an opening where all this red hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It rebounded on the back end of the empty water tank and shot out of the doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. And in seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave going over them. And then after the slag hits the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of basically lava that stretched in 40 feet in any direction. Now, unlike trying to run in, let's say, mud or deep water where you're just kind of moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, basically your foot melts into the slag. So with every step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. And so all these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and catching on fire, literally, they likely tried to start running, but it was like their bodies were slowly consumed by this slag feet first. And so Antonio tried to run like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere, and he fell onto the slag. So he's laying on his side, and as he's melting and burning to death, he reaches into his pants pocket with his free hand, and he pulls his phone out, and he calls his mother. She doesn't pick up, and so he leaves her a voicemail, and all he says is, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you hear is the hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. On the afternoon of July 29th, 2016, a 23-year-old college student named Felix stood in the break room of the industrial manufacturing company where he worked in northwestern Germany. He poured some cereal into a bowl, and then he took his carton of milk out of the communal fridge, and then with the cereal and his milk, he sat down at a table with 2 of his coworkers. So Felix was studying to become an engineer, and that was his primary focus. And on his breaks from school, he would work here as a machine mechanic. But as a result of that, basically just being a college kid looking for a side gig, it made him one of the youngest people at this company. And so oftentimes, Felix had a hard time relating to his coworkers, who were all basically a lot older than him. And in fact, now, as he sat down to eat his cereal, the two coworkers that were sitting there already, these two men named Otto and Klaus, who were in their 50s, it's like they didn't even look up and acknowledge him. They just continued silently eating their sandwiches as if Felix wasn't even there. At first, Felix put up with the fact that this lunch break so far was pretty awkward. Like there was no conversation happening here. He definitely felt like he did not belong here. But eventually, the silence was deafening at this table, and Felix just couldn't stand it. And so he said to his coworkers, Klaus and Otto, hey guys, how's the day going? And Klaus looked up and stared at Felix, and he just shrugged, said nothing, and went back to eating his food. Now, Klaus, admittedly, was known as sort of a loner employee who kind of kept to himself, so this behavior was somewhat normal, although somewhat off-putting to Felix, who's trying to obviously start a conversation here. But then Otto, he looked up, and he looked at Felix, and he was about to say something, but then paused, and this grimace came over his face, and he just said to Felix, you know what? I'm not having a good day. My head hurts, my stomach hurts, I feel tired, I feel kind of awful. And so now Felix is like, okay, sorry, Otto, I don't know what to tell you, that's tough. And then the three men just kind of went back to eating and back to silence. Now, Felix didn't know how to make this any less awkward, and so he just went back to eating his cereal in silence, and then when he was done, he got up and left the awkward break room. But Felix had only been back to his job for a couple of minutes when suddenly he felt this intense stomach cramp that made him double over in pain. Now, Felix actually was somewhat accustomed to getting cramps like this one because he was lactose intolerant. And typically, if he consumed dairy shortly thereafter, he would get these stabbing pains in his stomach. That's actually why he kept a carton of his own milk in the communal fridge that was lactose-free. And so suddenly, Felix wondered if maybe he had accidentally grabbed the wrong milk when he had poured his cereal just now. Had he grabbed regular milk, causing this pain? And so as a wave of nausea came over him, Felix sprinted back into the break room, opened up the communal fridge to see if he had grabbed the wrong milk. But he saw there was actually only one container of milk in the fridge, and it was his, the lactose-free kind. And so he had no idea what was actually causing these cramps because it couldn't have been dairy. But at this point, Felix was just so nauseous that all he could think about now was the fact that he could no longer work today. He had to go home. And so Felix told his supervisor he had to go, and then he rushed out to his car, he sped home, and barely made it into his bathroom in time in order to vomit into the toilet. And after he vomited, he felt a little bit better, and so he wiped his mouth, and he stood up straight, took a deep breath, and then he went to the sink and he splashed some water on his face, and he grabbed the towel and he went to dry his face, and as he did, he noticed something. He noticed the tips of his fingers were now tingling, like his hands were going numb. And so reflexively, he put down the hand towel and began flexing and opening and closing his hands over and over again to increase the circulation to his fingers, to maybe get the feeling back, but nothing he did seemed to help. And at this point, Felix couldn't help but feel a little bit scared. Now, stomach cramps and nausea were somewhat normal symptoms for him, considering, again, he was lactose intolerant. Those were normal symptoms of illness. But losing circulation in your hands was not something he was used to. This was something else. And so even though Felix was an adult, he was 23 years old, his first thought was, I gotta call my mom. And so that's what he did. 2 weeks later, Felix was still sick. On his mother's advice, he had gone to see his doctor, and his doctor had told him that he was very likely just overworked, and he prescribed Felix some vitamins and rest. But those two things had not helped Felix. In fact, really, his symptoms had only gotten worse. He was still nauseous, and that tingling feeling he had felt in his hands had now extended all the way up into his forearms. And so as a result of this mystery illness afflicting Felix, he had not been able to go back to work, and he had spent the better part of the last 2 weeks just lying miserably in bed. But this morning, he was determined to get out of bed, take a shower, have a real meal, and basically just have a normal day. And so it started relatively well. He managed to, prop himself up and get out of bed. But as he staggered his way towards the bathroom, he lost his balance and had to grab onto the door to keep from falling to the ground. After steadying himself, Felix did attempt to keep walking towards the bathroom, but it was like the commands from his brain were not reaching his legs. And so he kept slipping and staggering and almost falling. And so eventually he just turned around to go back to bed, but immediately he kind of collapsed to the ground and had to literally crawl painstakingly back to the bed. And then when he had finally pulled himself back on there, he pulled out his phone and called his mom again. But this time, he was not calling for advice. He was calling for help. He needed her to drive him to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Felix laid in a hospital bed with his mother to his left and an emergency room neurologist to his right. The neurologist had heard about Felix's symptoms, and she was now performing a preliminary examination, which really consisted of lots of questions about Felix's drug use, about, a history of neurological problems in their family, had he had any recent head injuries. But basically all the questions she was asking him, he said no to. There weren't any precursors to him having these issues. Next, the neurologist poked Felix's arms to see what he could feel, because he was complaining of numbness and tingling. But it was kind of like wherever she poked in his arms, he couldn't really feel it. It was like the tingling sensation had totally taken over both arms. That's all he could feel. After that, she measured his muscle reflexes in his legs and also shined a light in both his eyes. And then after that, she put her tools down and she looked at Felix with a very worried expression on her face. She said that based on Felix's symptoms, she thought that some part of his nervous system, like his brain or his spinal cord, might be inflamed. And this type of inflammation can lead to things like nausea, numbness, and loss of coordination, all things Felix had been experiencing. And this inflammation could be caused by a number of different infections or an autoimmune reaction. But to know for sure, she would have to run some more tests. And so she advised Felix to be admitted to the hospital. 6 days later, the neurologist went to check in on Felix, who was still at the hospital. And as soon as she walked into his room and saw Felix, she saw he looked terrible. His body was limp, his face was swollen, and his eyes were sort of glazed over like he was staring off into the distance. By this point, doctors had run imaging scans on Felix and had discovered that his brain and brainstem were inflamed, like the neurologist had suspected. But the neurologist could not figure out why this was happening. Typically, inflammation like this was caused by an infection. But the neurologist had tested Felix for every infection she could think of that could have caused this, and all those tests had come back negative. So her new working theory was Felix must be having an extreme autoimmune reaction, which is basically when your immune system malfunctions and starts attacking your own body. Autoimmune reactions can cause things like brain swelling. But this theory didn't really help Felix very much. Because first of all, it was nearly impossible to test to see if this theory was even true, that it was an autoimmune reaction. And second of all, even if you knew that's what it was, unfortunately, autoimmune reactions are notoriously difficult to treat. Basically, it was a shaky diagnosis that did not come with an easy cure. The neurologist had given Felix some anti-inflammatory medication, hoping that maybe that would help, based on her research around autoimmune diseases. But it basically did nothing. And she knew that if she didn't find a way to lower the swelling in his brain and brainstem, that Felix could potentially suffer permanent brain damage or even death. So now, in Felix's hospital room, the neurologist walked over to him and tapped his shoulder, and she asked him how he was feeling. And Felix, when he sort of looked up at her, his eyes were rolled back in his skull, and it took a minute for him to focus on her. And then it was clear to the neurologist that it took all of his energy to croak out an answer. But the words he said didn't make any sense. He said, metal, mouth. And the neurologist said, what? What are you trying to say? And then he said, taste, water. And at that point, the neurologist realized what Felix was trying to say is that he had a metallic taste in his mouth and he wanted a cup of water to clear his mouth. The neurologist felt like this had to be a clue about what was going on with Felix. It was not some random symptom, this has to be connected to the totality of what was wrong with him. But she didn't know what a metallic taste in his mouth had to do with his other symptoms. And so she was baffled. So she just grabbed a cup of water off the nearby table and handed it to Felix. And Felix immediately put it to his lips and tried to drink it. But it was like he couldn't, and the water just dribbled down his chin onto his chest. And as the neurologist stared at her patient, she couldn't help but feel like she was just totally failing here. Obviously there was something horribly wrong with Felix, but she had not come up with a proper diagnosis yet. And all the medications and treatments she had suggested so far had done nothing for his symptoms. And she knew if she couldn't get the swelling to go down, it was just a matter of time before he suffered permanent brain damage or death. And so at this point, the neurologist realized a big change would have to be made in Felix's care. Clearly what she was doing was not working. And so she decided to transfer him from her hospital to a local university hospital where she knew there were some specialists there who they might be able to figure out what was going on here. But the next day at that university hospital, that team of specialists that had been assigned to Felix's case were just as baffled as the neurologist had been. Because now Felix didn't just have swelling in his brain and a metallic taste in his mouth. He also was experiencing kidney and liver failure. And this collection of symptoms meant Felix very likely did not have an autoimmune condition. They tested him again for more infections that, maybe could still leave the possibility open that it was an autoimmune condition. But again, those still all came back negative. And so effectively, these specialists who were here to, solve this puzzle were back at square one. They had made no further progress. And so at this point, all Felix's doctors could do was just hope that whatever illness was plaguing Felix would sort of resolve itself on its own. And they would just, do their best to manage his symptoms and try to keep him comfortable until it did. However, by September of 2016, so 2 months after that first day that Felix went home sick from work, he had not improved. He spent most of his time laying in bed unconscious, barely clinging to life. At this point, most of these specialists were just monitoring Felix. However, one of them still felt like a diagnosis here was still possible. We just need to keep looking. And so this doctor actually decided that instead of monitoring Felix, he was going to start looking into some medical research papers, because he figured, whatever Felix had to be really, really rare. If it wasn't, they would have figured it out by now, and they clearly had not. So he must have something rare. And if there's one place you can go to learn about very rare conditions and diseases, it's medical research papers. And so he began combing through all these papers, and sure enough, he would actually find a case about another patient who had the exact same symptoms as Felix, and they even appeared in the exact same order. First, the stomach cramps and nausea, followed by the tingling in the arms, then the loss of coordination in the legs, then the swelling of the brain, followed by the metallic taste in the mouth, and then ultimately kidney and liver failure. And just like Felix, this patient's diagnosis in this medical journal was not an infection, nor was it an autoimmune disease. Instead, it was a condition that was so rare, it had only been recorded 3 times anywhere in the world over the last century. But this doctor understood that even though Felix's symptoms did appear to match, it still was highly unlikely he actually had this diagnosis because it's so unbelievably rare. However, the doctor thought, well, I'll just rule this condition out. All I need to do is a simple blood test. And so he did this blood test on Felix, literally believing it would just rule this out, except when the results came back, it was positive. This doctor had just solved the case, the one that nobody else seemed able to do. But the doctor was not happy. Instead, as he stared at the test results, he was kind of horrified, because this diagnosis was a death sentence for Felix. There was no cure for this. And worse, this diagnosis meant other people potentially could be in danger here. And so the doctor knew his next step, of course, would be to contact Felix's family and tell them what he had discovered. But he also knew this was no longer just a medical problem. The doctor called local law enforcement, and they began their investigation immediately. They interviewed basically everyone Felix ever interacted with on a regular basis, and they also sent forensic technicians to all the places that Felix spent any time. And these technicians ran tests on all the surfaces that Felix might have touched at one point or another. They also ran tests on the food and the water that he might have consumed. They even at one point tried to test the air that Felix had potentially breathed. And they did all this because they were trying to find one very specific substance. But despite basically looking everywhere in Felix's life for weeks and weeks, they didn't find it. Meanwhile, Felix's condition only got worse. By the end of September, he had slipped into a vegetative state. But at least so far, the doctor's worst fears had not been realized. They actually expected other people to begin to turn up to hospitals with similar symptoms as Felix. But they hadn't. So, with no answers, but with no other victims either, the police investigation began to wind down. Felix remained in a vegetative state for months and then years, and officials still just had no idea how this actually happened to him. They just kind of concluded that, well, this was a horrible tragedy that very likely will never actually be explained. But at least hopefully it will never happen to anyone else. But then, 2 years after Felix fell into his coma, some very strange things began to happen at his old manufacturing job. So at this manufacturing company where Felix used to work, it actually was pretty commonplace for employees there to get sick fairly regularly, like more than normal. However, their illnesses were sort of basic. things like headaches and stomach aches and feeling sort of tired, things that didn't really raise big red flags. But now, Otto, the middle-aged man who had complained to Felix over their lunch break about his stomach and his head hurting, was going into kidney failure. And in fact, he was so sick he couldn't come to work anymore and had to get dialysis 3 times a week just to live. And also, another much younger employee, whose name was Elias, he was 26 years old, he had begun having stomach aches. Now, again, that was fairly common at this company, but for Elias, these were not normal stomach aches. These were crippling, severe, like you can't focus on anything else type of stomach aches, similar to the ones Felix was having. Now, Otto and Elias had not spoken to each other about their respective illnesses. This was a place where people just kind of got sick periodically and kept it to themselves. It was just not really that big of a deal. So they hadn't talked to each other, and they certainly had not connected what was happening to them to Felix and his illness, which was now over 2 years before. But that would all change one day in May of 2018. So again, we're still talking about 2 years since Felix went into his coma, when Elias was having his lunch in the company break room, and he would discover something that would connect everything and blow this case wide open. Elias's shocking discovery led police to do a search of a local home. And at first, this home seemed totally ordinary until they went down into the basement. Because down there, it looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. There was this metal table with all these beakers and scales on it, and then behind it were all these shelves that were stacked high with old jam jars and paint cans and even old mayonnaise bottles. And it would turn out, inside of these mismatched containers was a collection of deadly chemicals that a judge would later say were more toxic and more deadly than the literal chemical weapons that were used during World War I. This basement laboratory belonged to Klaus. He was one of the 2 employees that Felix sat with during that very awkward lunch break. The one was Otto, who told Felix he didn't feel very good, and the other was Klaus, the man who, when asked how his day was going, just looked up at Felix, shrugged his shoulders, and said nothing. It would turn out, for years, Klaus had been buying deadly chemicals online, mixing them together, and then sort of testing these concoctions on his coworkers. He would just poison their lunches and see what happened. Felix's very rare disease that only 3 people had experienced in the past century in the whole world was effectively extremely acute mercury poisoning. Basically, an ungodly high level of mercury poisoning. Because Klaus was literally just putting mercury into Felix's cereal, and he was just eating it up. In addition to poisoning Felix's cereal, Klaus also put lead literally right on top of Elias's sandwiches, and then he also put a combination of lead and cadmium into Otto's food. Klaus was only caught because Elias made that big discovery. While he was eating his lunch, he noticed there was a strange powder sitting on top of his sandwich, and so he called the police. Klaus never explained his motives for the poisonings. In March of 2019, he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And unfortunately, 10 months after that, Felix, who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years to that point, passed away. As for Elias and Otto, they still suffer from long-term effects of chemical poisoning. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now, for Sarah, this was really alarming, because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise. So clearly, something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person. And so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade, and Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil. The devil's come back, and so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet. No idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns, and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they begin making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure. But quickly, as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red. And she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth. And so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened to her, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claimed to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claimed that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. And the Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the Red Ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite. One evening in February of 2011, a man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner inside of his home in a rural village in China. Around him at the table were his 5 elderly aunts, who he lived with and took care of. Now, nobody spoke over dinner. It was totally silent. But this was common, and it was not awkward at all, because Yang actually preferred silence. He had been born with a disability that made it nearly impossible for him to speak. It also had left him blind in one eye, and over the course of Yang's life, he had been sort of bullied for his disability. And as a result, he really didn't like being around other people, and he certainly didn't like trying to talk to other people. I mean, that was really, again, something he had a really hard time doing. But in his life, the few people that totally accepted him and loved him were his family, in particular his 5 aunts. They didn't care at all that basically he never spoke. And so, for example, at this dinner table, there was no expectation that anybody would speak. And Yang loved it. But more than just feeling happy that he could be himself around his aunts, Yang also took a lot of pride in looking after his aunts. He wanted to make sure they were comfortable and well looked after in their old age. So after this silent dinner, Yang stood up and he cleaned the table off, and then he helped one of his aunts go up to her bedroom. And after getting her tucked in, and as Yang was about to go down and help the next aunt go to her bedroom, he heard sirens outside. Now, Yang lives in this very remote rural village in China that's actually so remote they didn't have their own police force. But even more specifically, Yang literally in his whole life had never even heard a siren or seen a police car. And so this is really unique. And so instead of going and helping his next aunt, Yang went outside to see what was going on. And as soon as he got out there, he looked down the hill. He was up on top of this hill. That's where his house was. He saw at the base of the hill, about 600 feet away, were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. Clearly something major was happening in his town. And so again, feeling very curious because he's never seen anything like this, Yang decides to continue to investigate. And so he leaves his home and begins walking down the road towards the cars. But he stops at a safe distance away because 1, he doesn't want to interfere, and 2, he really doesn't want to talk to the police because he can't really talk. And he's actually worried that he's going to get bullied if he talks to the police. And so from a safe distance, he just stood there and watched whatever was going on. And what was going on is the 2 police officers who had responded and shown up in Yang's village were standing there at the foot of this hill trying to make sense of this insane story a local farmer had just told them. The man was sitting there, his face was in his hands, he was crying hysterically, and he was trying to give them more information, but it was like he was too upset. And finally, one of the officers tells the guy, hey, stop what you're doing, start all over again, calm down, and just tell us the story from the beginning. And at this, the farmer did calm down, and after taking a deep breath, he told the officer the story. He said about a week earlier, he had this horrible nightmare. He said he dreamed of his mother and she was shrouded in darkness and she was terrified and she was screaming for his help. And the farmer said, in the dream, he ran to his mother to try to save her. But as soon as he would get close to her, it was like this shadow went over his mother and then she disappeared. And then the farmer would wake up and he'd be so terrified and so upset. Now, at first, the farmer told the officer that, he didn't think much of this nightmare. He was not a superstitious person. He just thought, it's a nightmare. But over the next several days, he kept having the same nightmare about his mother that, she was scared and then she would disappear as soon as he went to help her. And so after a week of these horrible dreams, the farmer said he finally decided, I'm just going to go check on my mother in person and make sure she's okay. But when he went to his mother's place, his mother was missing and he couldn't find her anywhere. And he had this horrible thought that she'd been abducted. And so he had called the police. Now, the police did understand that it was totally bizarre that they were here ultimately because of some guy's nightmare. But when they went to his mother's place, she really was missing. And so they ultimately told the farmer to just go home and that they would put together a search party and they would look for his mother. And so after the farmer said okay and then headed back towards his place, the 2 officers got back in their cruisers and they drove out of the village past Yang, who was still standing there watching everything happening, back to the police station. And there, the officers immediately coordinated 2 investigative teams that would go out and look for the farmer's mother. Now, one of these teams was sent to a local city to basically canvass the area to see if she was there. But that search proved to be fruitless. And then the other investigative team, they were sent back to the village. And when they were there, they went door to door asking all the residents if they had any idea what happened to this farmer's mother. And it was during this search in the village that they got a tip. And that tip would lead them to a very specific location, Yang's home. And when police went to Yang's home, they found the front door was wide open. But when they walked right up and yelled inside of the home, calling out for Yang, nobody yelled back. In fact, the home was totally dark and silent. And so after a few more minutes of police calling out for anyone inside the home to come out and talk to them and not getting an answer, the police decided to walk inside. And so into this dark, cramped home they went. And as they walked, they noticed there were all these dirty towels and dirty dishes and sort of trash everywhere. The place was kind of a pigsty. And again, it's eerily silent. Every step they took, they were walking on these boards that creaked with every step. And as they're moving, they're calling out, Yang, if you're in here, come out. But again, it's totally silent. And they eventually make their way to the very back of the home. Now, the police really did not know what to expect when they showed up at Yang's place, But they did hope that by going there, they would somehow, some way find a reasonable explanation for all of this. You know, the dream that kicked off this investigation and this totally bizarre tip they got. I mean, they really just wanted to put this thing to bed, and they were hoping that by going to Yang's place, they would get that. However, when the police walked into the very last room they had not searched yet, the very back of his home, they knew there was no reasonable explanation here. That back room is where Yang's aunts all slept. And when the police walked into that room, sure enough, the aunts were in their beds where Yang had left them. However, the police realized, wait a minute, we have been yelling and screaming and trying to get people to come out of the home, yet all these women are still asleep. How could they possibly sleep through all that commotion? But as the police walked up to each of these 5 women, they realized the outlandish tip that had sent them here in the first place had to be correct. It would turn out Yang did not harm that farmer's mother. In fact, he did the opposite. She was one of his 5 elderly aunts, and he went to great lengths to care for each of these women. I mean, he basically would have done anything for them. However, there was a problem. His 5 aunts were dead, and had been for a long time. While Yang considered these women to be his family, literally, I mean, he called them his aunts, in reality, he was not related to them at all. Instead, these were just women from the local village where he lived who had been nice to him. They had all died of natural causes. But Yang didn't understand it when they passed away. Instead, all Yang knew is that he was sort of an outcast and that nobody respected him and he was treated really badly by most people except for these women. They'd been the only people that really cared about him. And so after they died, he felt really sad and lonely. And so, one by one, he dug these women up and brought them home with him and began caring for them as if they were still alive. When that farmer had gone to go check on his mother after having the recurring nightmare about, her going missing, he had gone to her gravesite and found her coffin was literally empty, hence believing somebody had abducted her body. And then the strange tip police got that led them literally to Yang's house was a local had seen Yang carrying a body up the hill to his home. And his home actually was not a typical home. Instead, Yang's home was actually just a cave that he had outfitted with some boards on the ground for a floor and a couple of makeshift beds. Yang was arrested for what he did, but ultimately he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. All of the bodies that Yang stole were reburied, and the farmer's recurring nightmares about his mother stopped as soon as her body was returned to her grave. At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends
friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call 2 people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually a resident of Owen Hall who didn't know Wade and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there. He kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up. He turned around and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said keep out, it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level, so you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door, and down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it. Because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind this door doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it and it's open. And so he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him, and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it and he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind, and he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turns sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower, usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly. But because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not, because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name.
In the early 1980s, John Harder was the classic, athletic, popular kid at his high school in Delaware, Ohio, which is a relatively small town just outside of the state's capital. But unlike most stereotypes that paint high school jocks as being these total jerks that bully people and they're kind of stupid, John was none of those things. He was incredibly friendly and very warm-hearted and seemed to get along with everyone. John also was known for having a great sense of humor. In particular, he liked to play these kind of harmless pranks that would make people smile, like the time he very enthusiastically joined the cheerleaders during a high school pep rally, despite not actually being a cheerleader himself. John was set to graduate from high school on June 5th, 1983, and his plan was to study accounting at Kent State University the following year. A few weeks before his graduation, John's high school began selling these tickets to a grad night at a huge amusement park called Kings Island. Kings Island was located about 2 hours west of John's high school, and it was home to dozens of roller coasters, water slides, and many other
other attractions. During their so-called grad nights, this amusement park would shut down their public operations and not let anybody into the park that did not have these special student tickets that they gave to local area high schools. John, who was 17 years old at the time, was very excited at the idea of going to this grad night, and so he went and purchased tickets along with about 20 other students from his high school. At about 3:30 p.m. on Friday, May 13th, John and the other students who had bought grad night tickets met up outside of their high school. While this was a school-sponsored trip, the students were responsible for driving themselves to the park. And so after all the students were accounted for, they all piled into a couple of their cars and they began their journey to the park. After a few stops along the way to get food and go to the bathroom, the students finally arrived at the park at about 7 p.m. And on the drive, John, who had been a passenger, had drank half a bottle of rum and about 3 to 6 beers. And so when he got out, he could barely stand. He was so drunk. And so the students made their way over to the front gate. They showed the attendant their grad night ticket and they were allowed inside. And surprisingly, despite it being this special night where only people with these tickets were allowed in, it was still pretty crowded. There were lots of students that apparently wanted to come to this event. Once John and the rest of the students from the Delaware High School had come inside the park, there was no rule that they had to stick together for the duration of their time there, and so they all kind of broke into their separate groups and went their separate ways. In John's particular group was his girlfriend Pam, and for the first hour they were in the park together, all they did was bicker and fight. Onlookers would say John looked visibly upset and very emotional and very drunk. By 8:30 p.m., when John's group had gotten in line for this roller coaster, John was now openly saying, "I don't want to be here anymore, I just want to go home." It was pretty obvious he was still just mad at Pam, and that's why he was saying all this, was just trying to make Pam feel bad. And so some of the group members told John, just, "Hey man, calm down, you're overreacting, just try to enjoy this ride, and then afterwards we'll get some food, it'll be fine." But it was pretty clear that John was really worked up and seemed incapable of having a good time at this point. But regardless, John and the rest of the group, they got on this ride at about 9 p.m., and then after the ride was over, they disembarked and they walked away from the ride to regroup and figure out what was next, and they're looking around and John is nowhere to be found. And so after waiting for a few minutes and actually walking around looking for him, they decided that, you know what, he was really upset before he got on this ride. He probably just wanted to walk away and be by himself for a bit. I'm sure we'll see him later in the night. So John's group, without John, just continued going around the park, going on different rides, and for the next few hours, they kind of forgot about John. It wasn't until the end of the night when over the loudspeaker, the park officials said, "Okay, we're closing the park now," that they started walking out and wondering where John was. And they were convinced, you know what, I'm sure he's back at the cars. He's probably waiting for us because he just wants to go home. And so they leave the park, they get out to their cars in the lot, and John's not there. And so at this point, the group's starting to get a little bit concerned because no one knows where he is. They're meeting up with the other groups from their high school. No one's seen John. And so they're all just kind of staring at the front gate, waiting for John to come out, but he doesn't. And then eventually the lights in the park start shutting down and the security guard comes out front and locks the front gate. And that's when the group knew they had a problem. After an extensive investigation by police, this is their best guess as to what happened to John. After John and his small group rode that roller coaster around 9 p.m., John very quickly disembarked the ride before anybody else in his group could see him, and then John stumbled his way towards the replica Eiffel Tower that this park was famous for. This tower stood at about 300 feet tall and was built to be an exact replica of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, but this one at Kings Island was only a third the size. It had 3 elevators that went up the center of the structure, and the elevators would stop at a 50-foot platform and a 275-foot platform where guests could look out and have a great view of the park. While today, the only way to access these 2 viewing platforms is through these elevators, at the time John was at the park in 1983, the park actually had a flight of stairs that went from the ground all the way to the very top of the tower that went right up the middle of the structure, and the public was allowed to take these stairs all the way up to the first platform, that 50-foot platform. And while the stairs did actually continue beyond that, up to the 275-foot platform, the public was not allowed to go any higher on the stairs than that first platform. And so if you took these stairs, once you got to the 50-foot platform, there would be a big fence right on the stairwell preventing you from going any farther. And it says authorized personnel only, don't go any farther. And so the only people that would walk up those additional flights of stairs were staff that had a special key. When John stumbled his way over to the base base of this replica tower, he did not get on an elevator. Instead, he took the stairs. So he made his way up to the 50-foot platform, and then when he got to this 6-foot tall gate preventing him from going any farther, he just climbed up and over it and continued walking up the stairs, and nobody stopped him. He finally came to a stop just below the 275-foot mark, and so he's on the stairwell, and at this point he turns and faces the inside of the tower. It's all these metal beams all over the place, and he climbs over the railing of the stairs he's on, and he climbs onto this narrow beam that's actually a